Hey guys, tonight we're going to take a slow, meandering stroll back in time. Not to mighty battlefields or bustling forums, but into the quiet, often overlooked corners of ancient Roman homes. Imagine yourself there, the oil lamps flickering low, the scent of beeswax and old wood hanging in the air, perhaps a distant murmur of the city settling down for the night. You're lying on a surprisingly firm mattress, probably filled with straw or reeds, and the sounds of chariots are a memory, replaced by the gentle chirp of crickets. It's a world both familiar and utterly alien when it comes to the simple act of falling asleep. You probably won't survive a single Roman night without wishing for your modern memory foam and climate control. But tonight, we're just observing, not experiencing the itch of those straw mattresses firsthand. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're settling in, let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. In ancient Rome, the quest for a good night's rest was, surprisingly, not that different from our own. They yearned for it, they sought remedies for its absence, and they had their own peculiar rituals to usher it in. But unlike us, they didn't have the glowing blue light of screens keeping them awake, or the constant hum of refrigerators, or the dread of an early morning alarm clock that buzzes with an utterly offensive enthusiasm. Instead, their sleep patterns were often dictated by the rhythms of the sun, the demands of their often physical lives, and for the wealthy, the sheer indulgence of having time to rest. You see, for the vast majority of Romans, life was a cycle of hard work under the unforgiving Mediterranean sun. Think about it. No tractors, no advanced plumbing, just sheer human effort for most tasks. After a day spent tilling fields, hauling goods, or crafting wares, exhaustion was probably the most reliable sleep aid available. Now, when you picture a Roman bedroom, what comes to mind? Perhaps a grand villa with frescoes and mosaic floors. That was certainly true for the elite, but for most Romans, especially those living in the sprawling, bustling cities, space was a luxury. You weren't sprawling out in a king-sized bed in a dedicated, cavernous bedroom. More likely, you were in a small, windowless cubicle, perhaps carved out of a larger shared living space in an insula. One of those multi-story apartment blocks that crammed thousands of people into surprisingly small footprints. These insulae were the Roman equivalent of our city apartments, often with shops on the ground floor and living quarters above. And just like today, the higher you went, the cheaper the rent, and often, the more precarious the construction. Imagine trying to get some quality sleep while your neighbor above you is clattering around, or perhaps a street vendor is still hawking their wares below. It wasn't exactly a tranquil sleep environment for everyone. The beds themselves varied wildly, too, depending on your social standing. If you were truly poor, your bed might be nothing more than a mat or a pile of straw on the floor. For the slightly better off, you'd have a simple wooden frame, perhaps with woven straps across it to support a mattress. And as we mentioned, those mattresses were rarely the plush, springs, and foam wonders we know. Often, they were filled with straw, reeds, or even wool. If you were wealthy, you might have feathers or even down. The Roman historian Pliny the Elder, bless his ever-curious heart, even mentions beds stuffed with swan feathers being a mark of extreme luxury. Can you imagine the sheer fluffiness? It makes you wonder if they ever had trouble getting out of bed. One of the curious aspects of Roman sleeping arrangements, particularly for families, was the communal aspect. While the very rich might have individual sleeping chambers, it wasn't uncommon for family members, and even some enslaved people, to sleep in the same room. Privacy, as we understand it today, was a much more fluid concept. Picture a small room, maybe a few bed frames, and everyone settling down for the night, the sounds of breathing, shifting, and perhaps the gentle murmur of sleep talk filling the space. It adds a whole new dimension to the idea of personal space, doesn't it? Historians still argue whether this was purely due to practical constraints of space, or if there was a deeper cultural preference for communal sleeping. But either way, it was a far cry from the isolated, individualistic sleep sanctuaries most of us crave today. It's almost as if they didn't invent the "do not disturb" sign. So you've settled onto your ancient Roman bed, perhaps adjusting a lumpy straw pillow. But the Romans didn't just hop into bed and expect instant unconsciousness. Their entire daily rhythm was structured in a way that arguably primed them for rest. The Roman day, unlike ours, revolved much more closely around daylight hours. You might wake with the sun, or even before it, ready for the prima hora, the first hour of daylight. For many, especially those who worked the land or toiled in workshops, the earliest hours were the most productive before the heat of the day truly set in. Imagine the quiet hum of activity rising with the sun rather than the blare of traffic. Now, a crucial part of the Roman daily routine, and something many of us might secretly envy, was the concept of the midday siesta. Yes, the Romans were big proponents of the afternoon nap. After a morning of work, often a light meal, and perhaps a visit to the public baths, it was common to retreat for a period of rest. This wasn't just for the lazy or the elite. It was a widely accepted, almost integral part of their day, especially in the warmer months. You'd find businesses closing, streets quieting, and people retreating indoors to escape the oppressive midday sun and catch some precious Z's. It makes you wonder how much more productive we'd be if we all embraced the glorious power of the power nap. No more hitting that 3 p.m. wall and reaching for another coffee, just a gentle, restorative doze. This midday break, sometimes called the meridiatio, wasn't always a full-blown sleep session. For some, it might have been a quiet period of contemplation or simply lounging. But for others, especially those who had risen at dawn, it was a legitimate opportunity to recharge. This practice subtly shifted their sleep patterns compared to modern habits. Instead of one long, uninterrupted stretch of sleep at night, many Romans likely experienced a form of biphasic sleep, where their nighttime sleep was naturally broken into 2 segments with a period of wakefulness in between. This wakeful period, often called first sleep and second sleep, was actually quite common before the advent of artificial lighting. People might use this time for quiet reflection, reading by moonlight, or even visiting neighbors. It sounds almost poetic, doesn't it? A calm, thoughtful break in the middle of the night, rather than frantically checking your phone. Speaking of daily rhythms, the Romans didn't have the same strict work-life balance concepts we do. For the wealthy, their mornings might be spent on social obligations, receiving clients in their homes, or attending legal proceedings. Their afternoons would then transition to leisure, often involving visits to the baths, exercise in the palestra, or convivial dinner parties. For the working class, it was more about the relentless grind of labor, punctuated by those essential breaks for food and, yes, that glorious nap. The pace of life, while certainly busy, felt less frantic, less driven by the constant ticking of a clock. Time was measured more by the sun and the natural ebb and flow of human energy. Imagine a world where your body clock dictated your schedule more than a digital calendar. A quaint idea, perhaps, but one that certainly sounds appealing when you're trying to unwind. One mainstream historical fact to consider is the Roman emphasis on public baths. These weren't just places to get clean. They were social hubs, centers for exercise, and crucially, a way to relax the body before rest. A long soak, a massage, perhaps some gentle stretching. All of these would have contributed to a state of physical relaxation conducive to sleep. You might spend hours at the baths, slowly moving through the different temperature rooms, from the tepidarium to the caldarium, and finally the frigidarium. It was a ritual of unwinding, a gradual shedding of the day's tensions, much like a modern spa day, but built right into the fabric of daily life. Now for a quirky tidbit. Did you know that some Romans used to sprinkle herbs and flowers like chamomile, rose petals, or even poppy seeds onto their mattresses or within their pillows? It wasn't just for scent, although that was certainly a bonus. They believed these plants possessed properties that could soothe the mind and encourage sleep. It's a precursor to our modern aromatherapy, isn't it? Though I doubt any Ramang ever debated the merits of lavender versus eucalyptus for optimal slumber. Perhaps they just sniffed around until something felt right. Finally, historians still argue whether the Roman practice of the midday siesta was purely a pragmatic response to the climate, or if it was also deeply ingrained in their cultural understanding of health and well-being. Was it simply too hot to work, or did they genuinely believe in the restorative power of a midday break for the mind and body? It's a debate that highlights how much of their daily lives, even the most seemingly mundane aspects, were interwoven with their philosophy and environment. Once the midday siesta was over and the sun began its slow descent, the focus for many Romans turned to the evening meal, the cena. And this, you might be surprised to learn, played a significant role in their sleep hygiene. Unlike our modern tendency to grab a quick, late-night snack or a heavy meal right before bed, the Romans, especially the elite, often made their cena the main meal of the day, typically eaten in the late afternoon or early evening. This meant their bodies had a good few hours to digest before they even thought about settling down for the night. Imagine enjoying a leisurely meal with friends and family, not rushing through it to get to the next item on your to-do list, but savoring the food and the company. It's almost as if they instinctively understood that going to bed on a full, distended stomach isn't exactly a recipe for peaceful slumber. Their diet, too, was quite different from ours, and it naturally influenced their sleep. While we often load up on sugary snacks or processed foods that can mess with our sleep cycles, the Roman diet was generally richer in whole grains, vegetables, fruits, and olive oil. Meat, while consumed, wasn't the daily centerpiece for everyone. Legumes, fish, and cheese were common. Think less greasy fast food and more Mediterranean freshness. They wouldn't have known about tryptophan, but many of their staples, like certain fish or dairy, would have naturally contained compounds that promote relaxation. However, it wasn't all quiet contemplation and healthy eating. The Romans certainly enjoyed their libations. Wine, often diluted with water, was a common accompaniment to meals. And while a moderate amount of alcohol might initially make you feel sleepy, as many of us know, too much can actually disrupt sleep later in the night. Did the Romans suffer from wine-induced insomnia? It's entirely plausible, though records of specific sleep complaints linked directly to alcohol consumption are, as you might expect, a little thin on the ground. Historians still argue about the exact potency of Roman wines and how widely they were consumed in large quantities by different social classes, which would certainly impact the potential for sleep disturbances. Now for a peculiar tidbit about Roman sleep aids. Some wealthy Romans would allegedly drink infusions made from lettuce. Yes, plain old lettuce. It sounds almost comical to us, but certain varieties of lettuce, particularly wild lettuce, contain lacticarium, a milky fluid that has mild sedative properties, sometimes referred to as lettuce opium. So, while you might think of a crisp salad as a refreshing daytime meal, for some Romans, it was the prelude to bedtime. You can almost hear a Roman matron saying, "Darling, have you had your evening dose of sleepy greens?" And speaking of curious customs, the Romans were also known to use honey for various ailments, and some texts suggest it was occasionally used as a sleep aid. Mixed with warm water or milk, it would have provided a gentle sugar boost to help lull you into slumber. It's a trick that still resonates today, isn't it? A warm drink and a touch of sweetness to usher in sleep. They were ahead of their time in some simple ways. For those who struggled with more persistent sleep issues, there were more potent and potentially dangerous remedies. Opium, derived from poppies, was known and used for its pain-relieving and sedative qualities. While not something you just pick up at your local Roman pharmacy for a mild case of insomnia, it was certainly available for more severe conditions, administered by physicians. This highlights a universal truth. Throughout history, humans have sought relief from sleeplessness, even if the methods were vastly different and often riskier than our modern pills. It makes you appreciate your melatonin supplement, doesn't it? No need to worry about accidentally getting too much poppy juice. The concept of dreams was also fascinating to the Romans. They didn't just see them as random neural firings. Dreams were often believed to be messages from the gods or omens of future events. Dream interpretation was a recognized practice, and there were even professional dream interpreters. So if you had a particularly vivid or disturbing dream, you might seek out someone to help you decipher its meaning. It adds a whole layer of psychological engagement to their sleep experience that we, in our more secular age, might have lost. Imagine waking up and not just thinking, "Wow, that was weird," but genuinely pondering if Jupiter was trying to tell you something. Perhaps you dreamt you forgot your toga for a formal event, a truly terrifying prospect. Now that you're fed and perhaps a little sleepy from that hypothetical Roman lettuce infusion, let's consider the crucial aspects of Roman hygiene and comfort that prepared them for rest. We've already touched upon the public baths, those magnificent complexes that were far more than just places to wash. Think of them as the ultimate pre-bedtime ritual. You wouldn't just pop in for a quick shower. You'd dedicate hours. First, you'd head to the apoditerium, the changing room, where you'd strip down and perhaps store your belongings. Then, it was off to the exercise grounds, the palestra, to work up a gentle sweat. Yes, even before relaxing, they believed in a bit of physical exertion to tire the body in a good way. After a workout, you'd move through the progressively warmer rooms. The tepidarum for a gentle warm-up, the caldarium where the really hot water and steam would open your pores, and perhaps a vigorous scraping with a strigil to remove dirt and sweat. This scraping, by the way, was often done by attendants, which sounds incredibly luxurious and effective for relaxation, doesn't it? No more struggling to reach that awkward spot on your back. Finally, a plunge into the frigidarium, the cold pool, to close those pores and invigorate the senses. This entire process, from exercise to the varying temperatures, would have left you utterly relaxed, muscles soothed, and body thoroughly clean. It was a full-body reset, a true unwind before settling down for the evening. You can imagine the feeling of drifting off after such a thorough cleansing. It makes our quick nightly shower seem almost perfunctory by comparison. Beyond the baths, Roman homes, particularly those of the wealthier citizens, incorporated elements designed for comfort that subtly contributed to better sleep. While central heating as we know it didn't exist, they had hypocaust systems, where warm air from a furnace circulated under the floors and behind walls. Imagine the feeling of a warm floor beneath your bare feet on a chilly Roman night. It sounds incredibly cozy, a far cry from shivering in a drafty room. This radiant heat would have created a much more comfortable sleeping environment, preventing the chills that often disrupt sleep. Of course, this luxury was largely limited to the affluent, so for the vast majority, the warmth of extra blankets and huddling close might have been the primary method of staying warm. And what about the noise? Cities are never truly silent, and ancient Rome was no exception. Yet, within the private homes of the elite, efforts were made to create a sense of tranquility. Courtyards, often with fountains, provided a gentle, ambient sound. Gardens, with their rustling leaves and birdsong, would have offered a natural buffer from the clamor of the streets. Windows, if present, might have been small and high to maintain privacy and reduce external noise. One quirky tidbit: some wealthier Romans might even have had enslaved people whose specific task was to ensure quiet in the house during sleeping hours, perhaps shooing away stray dogs, or politely asking late-night revelers to keep it down. Talk about bespoke sleep services. For beds themselves, Beyond the filling, the Romans used various types of bedding to enhance comfort. Fine linen sheets were common for those who could afford them, offering a smooth, breathable surface against the skin. Woolen blankets provided warmth. Pillows, as mentioned, ranged from basic bags of straw to luxurious feather-filled cushions. The lectus cubicularis, the bed specifically designed for sleeping, often had a raised frame, lifting you off the potentially cold or damp floor. This design not only offered comfort, but also practical benefits, keeping pests at bay. One mainstream historical fact to remember is the Roman invention of indoor plumbing and sophisticated drainage systems. While not directly sleep-related, knowing that your waste was being efficiently carried away, rather than lingering outside your window, certainly contributed to a more hygienic and pleasant living environment, reducing odors and pests that could disrupt sleep. Imagine trying to get some rest with the pungent smells of an overflowing cesspit just outside your bedroom window. A clean environment, even by ancient standards, was undoubtedly a step towards a more restful night. Historians still argue whether the elaborate bath rituals were purely about hygiene and social custom, or if the Romans also explicitly recognized their psychological benefits for stress reduction and consequently better sleep. Was it a conscious pre-sleep routine, or just a happy side effect of their daily lives? The answer likely lies somewhere in between, but the outcome was undoubtedly a body and mind more prepared for slumber. So you're clean, well-fed, and your body is pleasantly tired from your day, and perhaps a visit to the baths. Now, let's consider the actual soundscapes and curious sleep aids that Romans encountered or employed to usher in that elusive slumber. Unlike our world, filled with the constant drone of electricity, traffic, and distant sirens, ancient Rome's nighttime sounds were dictated by nature and human activity. For those in the countryside, the night would have been filled with the rustle of leaves, the chirping of cicadas, and the hooting of owls. A natural, ambient soundscape that many of us now try to replicate with white noise machines. In the cities, however, things were a little different. While the midday siesta offered a respite, the evenings could still be surprisingly noisy, even after dark. Chariots were often banned from city streets during certain nighttime hours in some areas to reduce noise, but you'd still hear the clatter of foot traffic, the distant shouts of watchmen, and perhaps the occasional drunken reveler. Imagine trying to drift off to sleep with the muffled sounds of a distant party echoing through the narrow alleyways. Not quite the silent chamber we aim for. For the wealthy, as we touched on, courtyards and thicker walls help to dampen the noise. But for those in the insulae, the sounds of their neighbors and the street below would have been a constant lullaby, or a constant irritant, depending on the night. Beyond the natural and urban sounds, Romans also experimented with various concoctions and practices to encourage sleep. We've mentioned lettuce, but there were other, more potent, and sometimes more dangerous remedies. One mainstream historical fact is the use of mandragora or mandrake. This plant, with its distinctive forked root that sometimes resembles a human figure, was known for its narcotic properties. It was used as an anesthetic in surgery, but also, in smaller doses, as a sedative to induce sleep. The root could be steeped in wine or water, and the resulting draught was believed to bring about a deep slumber. However, mandrake is highly toxic, and its dosage would have been a perilous balancing act, often leading to hallucinogenic effects or worse. It puts our modern sleeping pills, with their carefully calibrated doses, into sharp perspective. You wouldn't want to accidentally take too much mandrake and end up conversing with your bedframe. Now for a quirky tidbit. Some Roman texts hint at the use of poppy seed bread or cakes as a sleep aid. While poppies are the source of opium, the seeds themselves contain only trace amounts of opiates and are generally safe to eat. So, a Roman lullaby might have literally involved a comforting carbohydrate packed with tiny, theoretically relaxing seeds. It's the ancient equivalent of having a warm glass of milk and a biscuit before bed, though perhaps with a little more botanical intent. Another method, less about ingestion and more about environmental control, was the use of scented oils and burning incense. Frankincense and myrrh, though often associated with religious rituals, were also used for their aromatic properties in daily life. Burning these resins, or diffusing oils like lavender, could create a calming atmosphere conducive to sleep. Imagine a faint, sweet, smoky aroma gently filling your sleeping chamber, a subtle signal to your brain that it was time to relax. It's almost a primitive form of aromatherapy, aiming to soothe the senses and quiet the mind. One open scholarly debate surrounds the extent to which Romans truly understood the pharmacological effects of these plants versus relying on traditional knowledge and anecdotal evidence. Did they grasp the chemical compounds at play? Or was it simply a matter of, this plant makes people sleepy, therefore we use it for sleep? It's a fascinating question that highlights the blend of empirical observation and mystical belief that characterized much of ancient medicine. We know for sure they were experimenting, even if their understanding of the underlying science was different from ours. Finally, consider the concept of a sleep charmer, or someone who would tell stories or recite poetry to lull a person to sleep. While not a widespread professional role, the idea of a soothing voice spinning tales, perhaps of gentle myths or historical anecdotes, sounds like the perfect ancient equivalent of a sleep podcast. Imagine someone whispering tales of legendary heroes or forgotten cities until you drifted off. It makes you think that even without technology, the human desire for a comforting voice to guide us into slumber has always been there. Perhaps that's why you're listening to me now. Having explored the Roman environment, diet, and even their botanical remedies for rest, let's delve a little deeper into the philosophy of rest itself, and how the Romans viewed sleep not just as a physical necessity, but sometimes as something more. For many Romans, particularly the Stoics and Epicureans, philosophers whose ideas permeated Roman thought, there was a recognition of the body's needs. While they debated the nature of pleasure and virtue, the fundamental requirement for rest was rarely questioned. You wouldn't find a Roman philosopher advocating for endless wakefulness as a path to enlightenment. Sleep was seen as restorative, a natural process essential for both physical and mental well-being, even if they didn't have our modern understanding of brain waves and REM cycles. One mainstream historical fact is that the Romans understood the concept of otium and negotium. Negotium was literally no leisure, signifying work, business, and public affairs. Otium was leisure, a time for rest, contemplation, and personal pursuits. While otium wasn't always about sleep, it certainly encompassed the idea of stepping away from the demands of the day to recharge. For the elite, otium might involve reading, writing, gardening, or philosophical discussion. Activities that, by their nature, would calm the mind and prepare it for rest. It wasn't about being unproductive. It was about being productive in a different, more personal way. Contrast that with our modern hustle culture, where downtime is often viewed with suspicion. The Romans, in their wisdom, knew the importance of switching off. Now for a quirky tidbit. Some Roman literary sources, particularly those focused on rhetoric, occasionally mention the idea of sleeping on a problem. The orator Cicero, for instance, might suggest putting aside a difficult legal argument until the morning, believing that the mind, through the unconscious processing of sleep, might arrive at a solution. This is surprisingly similar to our modern advice to sleep on it when faced with a perplexing decision. It suggests an intuitive understanding that sleep isn't just an absence of activity, but a period of internal work for the brain. Perhaps they were secretly hoping for a divine download of legal loopholes while they snored. The Romans also had a complex relationship with their dreams. As we briefly touched upon, dreams were not just random images. They were considered potentially significant, carrying omens or messages from the gods. This wasn't just folklore. It was deeply woven into their religious and cultural fabric. People would consult professional dream interpreters or interpret somniorum, to understand the cryptic narratives that unfolded in their sleep. Imagine waking up in a cold sweat after dreaming of a black cat crossing your path, and then immediately seeking out a specialist to tell you if you're about to lose a legal case or find a hidden treasure. This level of engagement with the dream world certainly added a layer of psychological complexity to their sleep experience that we, in our more rational age, have largely dismissed. It makes you wonder if they ever had a dream about being late for a gladiatorial combat. For some, particularly those who are superstitious or devout, specific rituals might be performed before bed to ensure peaceful sleep or to invite prophetic dreams. Offering prayers to deities associated with sleep, like somnus, or making small offerings at a household shrine, could have been common practices. These weren't necessarily physical sleep aids, but psychological ones, providing a sense of comfort and protection as they drifted off. It's the ancient equivalent of saying your prayers before bed, a way to quiet anxieties and invite a sense of peace. One open scholarly debate among historians concerns the extent to which these philosophical and religious views on sleep permeated all levels of Roman society. Was the idea of otium purely an elite concept, or did even the working class find their own forms of restorative downtime? And how seriously did the average Roman take dream interpretation? While the sources often reflect the views of the educated elite, it's reasonable to assume that some degree of popular belief in dream omens and the importance of rest was widespread, even if practiced in simpler forms. After all, the need for sleep is universal, regardless of your social standing or philosophical leanings. So, while their beds were simpler, their nights darker, and their understanding of neuroscience non-existent, the Romans intuitively grasped the profound importance of rest. They cultivated routines, sought comfort, and even pondered the deeper meanings of their nocturnal journeys. It was a quieter, perhaps more reflective way of ending the day, preparing the mind and body for whatever the next dawn would bring. As the Roman night deepened and the city quieted, save for the occasional distant bark or the gentle flow of water in a hidden fountain, the final preparations for sleep were complete. You've journeyed through their day, their meals, their baths, and even their philosophies of rest. But what about the final moments, that gentle glide into unconsciousness? What specific ambient sounds might have accompanied their descent into slumber? And were there any last-ditch efforts to ensure a restful night? For many, especially in rural areas, the dominant sounds would have been those of the natural world, the soft rustle of leaves in an olive grove, a distant bleating of sheep, or the rhythmic croaking of frogs from a nearby marsh. These are the organic soundscapes that modern apps try to replicate, but for Romans, they were simply the backdrop of existence. Imagine the quiet hum of insects on a warm summer night, a subtle chorus that wasn't intrusive, but rather a comforting white noise, a natural lullaby. Even in a bustling city like Rome, the sounds within a private home, especially within the inner courtyards of a wealthy domus, would have been muted, the splashing of a fountain a gentle counterpoint to the distant urban murmurs. Beyond the natural soundscape, the Romans also had simple, almost ritualistic, ways of ensuring comfort that would encourage sleep. We've discussed the beds and bedding, but consider the subtle details. The adjustment of a woolen blanket against a cool night air, the settling of a straw mattress into a comfortable dip, the final extinguishing of an oil lamp, plunging the room into near total darkness. In a world without electric lights, the transition from day to night was much more pronounced. A gradual dimming that naturally signaled to the body that it was time to wind down. No bright screens to disrupt melatonin production. No sudden flick of a switch. Just a slow, gentle fade into darkness. One mainstream historical fact is the Roman understanding, however rudimentary, of circadian rhythms. While they didn't have the scientific terminology, their lives were largely governed by the rising and setting of the sun. Waking with the dawn, working through the light, and winding down as darkness fell naturally aligned their bodies with the solar cycle. This inherent connection to natural light and dark cycles is something we often struggle to maintain in our electrically lit world. It's almost as if their bodies were instinctively more in tune with the rhythm of rest, simply because there were fewer artificial distractions. Now for a quirky tidbit. Some sources suggest that very wealthy Romans, especially those prone to insomnia, might have employed specific enslaved individuals or household staff, whose primary role was to stay awake and ensure the quietness of the household. This could involve gently shooing away stray animals that might bark, discreetly dealing with noisy neighbors, or simply remaining silent and vigilant to ensure no disturbances reached their master's ears. Imagine having someone else literally guard your sleep. It's the ultimate luxury, the ancient equivalent of a soundproof chamber and a personal security detail for your slumber. The Romans also had a range of small, personal amulets or charms that some might keep by their bedside or even under their pillow, believing they offered protection from bad dreams or evil spirits during sleep. These weren't necessarily sleep aids in a physical sense, but they provided psychological comfort, a sense of safety that could help calm the mind before drifting off. Whether it was a small figurine of a protective deity or a simple piece of lucky stone, these items offered a tangible link to a sense of security in the vulnerability of sleep. One open scholarly debate continues regarding the Roman experience of sleep disorders. While they certainly had terms for sleeplessness, it's hard to quantify how widespread chronic sleep issues truly were. Did the natural rhythms of their lives, the physical labor, and the lack of artificial light mean that general insomnia was less common than today? Or were cases simply underreported or attributed to different causes, such as spiritual afflictions rather than physiological ones? It's a fascinating question because it speaks to how deeply our modern lifestyles might contribute to our own sleep struggles. As you picture that final Roman moment, imagine the gentle breeze through an open window, carrying the faint scent of night-blooming jasmine, the distant echo of a city settling down, and the comforting weight of a woolen blanket. The worries of the day, the demands of the forum, the intricacies of the law, all gently receding into the background as the mind prepares to embark on its own nightly journey. They may not have had our scientific understanding, but the Romans, in their own practical and sometimes whimsical ways, sought the same peace and restorative power of a good night's rest. The sounds of the ancient Roman night begin to soften now, fading into a gentle whisper. The rustle of dry leaves on a terracotta roof, the distant, muffled calls of night creatures, the soft, rhythmic breathing of a city finally at peace. You can almost feel the cool, clean air on your skin, the subtle scent of old stone and damp earth drifting in through an open window. Your own breath grows deeper, slower, matching the quiet rhythm of the ancient world as it slips into slumber. The worries of today, like the distant sounds of a forgotten empire, gently recede, growing smaller and smaller, until they are just faint echoes in the vastness of the past. Let the images of quiet courtyards and warm baths drift through your mind like clouds across a Roman sky. There's nothing left to do, nowhere left to be, but here, now floating on the edge of sleep. The history has woven its gentle spell, and it's time to surrender to its quiet embrace. Good night and sweet dreams.